The strikes, everyone is talking about the strikes on Syria. Fox on top of missiles raining down as the U.S., U.K., and France all team up. And it is all making Vlad very, very mad. Welcome, everybody. I'm Neil Cavuto. Russian President Vladimir Putin calling these strikes on chemical weapon sites in Syria an act of aggression. His ambassador going even further, saying that there will be consequences. Here's what we know right now. The Pentagon saying that all the missiles launched against Syria did in fact hit their targets. The president tweeting, mission accomplished. Russia calling an emergency meeting at the UN Security Council on Syria, now set for 11 a.m. Eastern Time, about an hour from now, and we are on it. We are also on top of a closed-door NATO meeting going on as we speak in Brussels on those airstrikes. We'll be getting a live NATO briefing from that when it lets up right afterwards. To Kevin Corke with the latest from the White House right now. Hey, Kevin.
Hey there, my friend. Listen, this is very interesting times, not just for this White House, but more broadly for U.S. foreign policy, as not just the U.S. and its allies, but the world begins to speak, Neil, with one voice, which is you cannot let this stand. You cannot let a madman continue to use chemical weapons to hurt his own people. And that is what the president has basically said about those targeted strikes. Let me take you to Twitter, his favorite social media platform. He said a perfectly executed strike last night. Thank you to France and the United Kingdom for their wisdom and the power of their fine military. He goes on to say this, could not have had a better result. Mission accomplished. Of course, last night the president said the coalition had marshaled their righteous power against barbarism and brutality in punishing the Assad regime for its continued use of chemical weapons on the Syrian people. By the way, those comments were coming, Neil, just as explosions were rocking Damascus. Now, the strikes themselves were limited, as you pointed out, and it included the allies from France and the UK. All this in response to the use of chemical weapons on civilians, even children, that quite frankly shocked the international community.
The nations of the world can be judged by the friends they keep. No nation can succeed in the long run by promoting rogue states, brutal tyrants, and murderous dictators.
Murderous dictators. Now, let me take you to a statement issued not long ago. This from Russian President Vladimir Putin. He wrote this on April 14th. U.S., supported by its allies, launched an airstrike against military and civilian targets in the Syrian Arab Republic, an act of aggression against a sovereign state that is on the front line in the fight against terrorism, was committed without a mandate from the UN Security Council and in violation of the UN Charter and norms and principles of international law. There's also been pushback, Neil, here domestically. Some Democrats saying that this doesn't actually meet the rule of law here either. They say that the president doesn't have the proper authority to do this without congressional consent. Of course, the AUMF, that we have the authorization use of military force in post 9/11 days, that is still intact, and that's the argument being used here and at the Pentagon as well. Very interesting. I'm going to get more details for you later in this hour, and if I get a return call from someone that I think you know very well, I will be sure to pass along details, but for now, back to you.
All right, I'll keep the secret. All right, thank you very much. Kevin Corke at the White House is the very latest there. Now, the Pentagon says all missiles, despite what the Russians and the Syrians are saying, did hit their intended targets. Lucas Tomlinson is at the Pentagon with the very latest on that. Lucas.
Well, Neil, a Pentagon briefing just wrapped just a few minutes ago. It was about 45 minutes long, and it was very fascinating. All the missiles not only hit their targets, they hit within a few minutes, according to a senior military official here. It took a few hours to get tankers in the air. It took missiles to launch to arrive at the same time. It was 105 missiles among the U.S., French, and British forces, all arrived on 3 targets, which took the Assad's chemical weapons, ability to carry out chemical weapons attack away. Take a listen.
Attack the heart of the Syrian chemical weapons program. Now, I'm not saying that they're not going to be able to reconstitute it. And I'm not saying that it's going to continue. But this has dealt them a very serious blow.
And Lieutenant General McKenzie here at the Pentagon said there were a number of U.S. assets involved. The USS Monterey in the Red Sea, a guided missile cruiser, as well as the USS Laboon, another guided missile destroyer. Those fired from the Red Sea. Why? Because the Tomahawk has a range of over 1,500 miles. What was interesting was there was a little bit of a Twitter deception, you might say. The U.S. Navy earlier this week had tweeted out that the USS Donald Cook had left Cyprus and was in the eastern Mediterranean. That warship did not strike, Neil. Now, in addition to the U.S. Navy assets, you had B-1 bombers flying from an air base in Qatar, launched dozens of standoff missiles. You had French fighter jets. You had British fighter jets. You even had an American submarine, the USS John Warner, which we heard about for the first time this morning, although Fox News was withholding that name because of operational security, Neil.
Thank you very, very much. Meanwhile, Russia is condemning last night's airstrikes in the strongest terms. Russia's ambassador to the United States, Anatoly Antonov, responding to the strikes by saying, in part, we warn that such actions will not be left without consequences. All responsibility for them rests with Washington, London, and Paris. Insulting the president of Russia is unacceptable and inadmissible. The U.S., the possessor of the biggest arsenal of chemical weapons, has no moral right to blame other countries. Retired U.S. Army General and former Pentagon Deputy Secretary of Intelligence Jerry Boykin joining us on the phone. General, obviously the Russians, were not even consulted, we're told, or given a heads up on this as they were last year. I'm sure that was by design and quite deliberate. What do you make of that?
Well, first of all, the deconfliction process itself certainly gave them some indication of what was happening, not to mention the fact that we've been talking about this for a week. But look, Neil, this is what I think is important. We need to remember that the Russians are complicit in this. It was the Russians that were supposedly taking control of Assad's chemical weapons. And they I think, were not honest about that, about what they did, but it's unquestionably, Assad could not have used those chemical weapons without at least the Russians knowing about it because of deconfliction. So I think that given that the Russians are outgunned in that part of the world, the last thing they need to do now is provoke another response, but this time targeting them.
You know what's interesting, General? The way, of course, the Russian ambassador came out so, apoplectic about this, but in one of his comments saying it is insulting the president of Russia, and that's unacceptable and inadmissible. And I'm just thinking, when you say something like that, this was about not respecting Vladimir Putin enough. What did you make of that?
Yeah, I thought that was a bizarre comment. It was sort of like, the British were the ones that actually used the chemical weapons. You ask yourself, what fairyland do they live in? That was a nonsensical thing. I don't know if there's something that I don't know about Russian diplomatic language, but I would guess that it's they probably just had a big run on the vodka there in Russia. All over my head.
Well, General, they're going to have this emergency UN powwow on this, urged by Russia, a member of the Security Council. So I guess any member can demand such a meeting. What will come of it?
Well, look, 3 of the permanent members of the Security Council were the coalition that did this. By the way, I think the fact that it was a coalition operation is significant. This is the first time that I think we could say President Trump has brought this kind of coalition together. Well, what's going to happen? Well, nothing. They're going to talk about it. The Russians are going to get a little propaganda out of it. But in the end of the day, I don't think the Russians are going to be able to do a whole lot. The last thing they want to do is pick themselves a target there by this coalition and probably others, because look at the fact that the whole Persian Gulf region now, with the exception of Bahrain, which is primarily Shia, are lining up behind us, leading that effort in the Gulf of the Saudis. So I think the Russians have gotten themselves into a very bad situation.
You know what, General? The Pentagon has already said that this strike took out the heart of Syria's chemical weapons program, but went on to say that Assad still has this residual capacity. What does that mean?
Well, I think that it means that they avoided targets where they know chemical weapons were stored or there are other production facilities because of the potential for collateral damage, and read that as civilian casualties.
Okay, General, thank you Very, very much. The world is just trying to make sense of what happened in Syria and whether there could be a follow-up action. So far, no indications that there will be. But right now, we are focusing on that as Russia is demanding this emergency meeting at the UN. And that is still slated to happen within the next hour. We'll let you know how that goes. In fact, we'll take you there after this.
Neil, I'm actually standing along the Israeli-Syrian border. Behind me, off in the distance, a few hundred yards, is Syria. And perhaps no country is watching events unfold in Syria more closely than Israel. A senior-level cabinet minister said following the airstrikes that they send an important
in Syria without being involved, in the sense that there are no Israeli troops in Syria, but they are watching very carefully the passage of weapons from Iran through Iraq and Syria into Lebanon. And they act whenever they feel they can, they should, they would. But at the same time, they will be very nervous, that's the Israelis, of seeing Iran deploying missiles, deploying drones. The Israelis have shut down at least one, if not more, Iranian drone over Israeli airspace. Now think of it, if the Iranians or the Syrians will weaponize these missiles or these drones, they are at 20-25 minutes away from the center of Israel, flight-wise. So that's why the Israelis have a lot of stakes in what's happening in Syria.
Do you think everyone would be happier if Assad were dead? That he triggers a lot of this, and his association with the Russians and this tight relationship he has with Vladimir Putin, that's the problem. He's got to go.
Yes, I want to be a little bit more realistic than this. If Assad would have been gone in a way or another, either internally, and this could have happened during the civil war, there were attempts against him,
right,
or missile-wise, the Russians and the Iranians will produce another Assad. There will be Assad 3. It may not have the last name, the same last name. This is a system. And those who are really in control of Syria today, of the political and military mechanism, are the Iranians. The Russians provide the umbrella. So it's really a systemic change that needs to happen in Syria. But it should happen at the hands of the Syrians themselves. And we need to make sure that our allies on the ground are not jihadists, but they are the good guys with whom we could partner in the future. We're far from intervening in Syria. But if there is such a choice, we need to have the right allies on the ground.
Willie, thank you very, very much, my friend, for coming on Saturday and providing your expertise, as always. Much appreciated. All right, I want to switch up half a world away, certainly half a world away from that neck of the woods, to Peru right now. The vice president is there attending the summit of Western Hemisphere leaders. President Trump was to go to that. He sent the vice president in his stead because of everything going on in Syria, what was about to go down there. We'll keep you posted on that. More after this. All right, the president moving with England and France to launch a missile attack on Syria, and some in Washington are apoplectic. Even members of the president's own party says, you know what, when you do something like this, you got to check with us. First, to House Foreign Affairs Committee member, Republican Congressman from New York, Lee Zeldin. Congressman, when I had Rand Paul here the other day, he was of that mind, though. He supports the president, likes the president, thinks a great deal of the president. This is an overstep, this kind of thing from the president. He didn't like it when Barack Obama did it, doesn't like it when Donald Trump does it. What do you think?
The president's decision and the execution of the strikes last night were done, I believe, correctly, appropriately, proportionally. There should be a debate in Congress and amongst the American public, regardless of what year it is, whoever the president is, whoever's elected to Congress, with regards to the current authorization for the use of military force. There is an appropriate debate to be had as far as updating it and what the future should look like. So I would welcome that debate in Congress. It should be had. But make no mistake, the president's decision and the execution last night was absolutely spot on, correct, and I support it.
I think to simplify what the president has the power to do, I always read it from various presidents is that if it's a one and done kind of thing, we don't have to consult with Congress. If it looks like it could get more involved, or let's say we would revisit this, then they do. Is that right?
Well, first off, the president and the administration, they do talk frequently with Congress. There were frequent discussions over the course of the last week I know for myself personally, as it relates to many foreign policy decisions since this president has come into office, frequently consulting with me directly, with many of my colleagues. So that line of communication has very much been open, and I have no complaints about that. But regardless of whether it was President Obama, President Trump now, or whoever's next, beyond that communication, which is very important, I do believe that we should be having the debate as far as what the authorization should look like in 2018 and beyond. But we should not make any illusion that there are people who are on the other side who will oppose this president no matter what on everything and anything. And that really is a lot of what we're hearing. And then to get to the Rand Pauls and the Thomas Masseys and people who are very thoughtful as it relates to the Constitution and making sure that everything that the president does is appropriate and correct and respects the Article I powers of Congress. They are, for all of the right reasons they want to, beyond just having a good line of communication with the administration, they know that the debate needs to be had and that everything should be deliberate. That's a little bit less out to get the president of a mentality and more with regards to what's the best for the United States or national security, approaching it from a very constitutional perspective, and I respect that.
Well, the president is pleased with the results overnight, and he tweeted out a couple of items today, but one that caught my eye was, "We could not have had a better result, mission accomplished." What did you think of choosing those words, mission accomplished?
The mission to degrade the capability of the Syrians to conduct chemical warfare, that particular mission last night was accomplished. The mission was not to completely eliminate the chemical weapons program of Syria. It was not a mission to replace the Assad regime. It wasn't to inject ourselves in Syrian civil war. The mission last night was one that doubled the amount of missiles from 1 year ago, that struck 3 targets instead of 1. That was not unilateral and instead was one of a coalition. And within minutes of each other, precisely hitting a target where we minimized collateral damage, where we conducted a proportionality test to make sure that the military advantage that was to be gained outweighed any type of collateral damage that may have happened. But we still have not heard of any civilian deaths as a result of
I know all that, sir. And I'm sorry it wasn't more clear. But when George W. Bush used that term back in 2003, the clear inference from that was that that's it. We were done. The battle and the toppling of Saddam Hussein and a better and freer Iraq was what was at hand. We know in retrospect it wasn't. I'm not here certainly to bash President Bush or to second guess President Trump. But do you think using those words, mission accomplished, gives Americans a false sense of security that this is done?
I think we need to understand what the definition of mission was that the president was saying was accomplished. And the mission for last night's operation was one to degrade the chemical weapons capability of the Syrians, and that mission was accomplished. We should not define mission more broadly, more permanently. We should not define it as one that was destroying Syrians' capability or replacing Assad or permanently changing his behavior, the Russians and the Iranians. If we go much broader in our definition than what was the actual mission of the operation last night, we would be wrongly interpreting what the president tweeted.
All right. Switching gears very quickly, Congress, you'll indulge me. Speaker Paul Ryan has indicated he is not going to seek re-election. Will step down in January. Talk was that in a taped interview on Meet the Press, his own candidate would be Kevin McCarthy to take that spot. How do you feel about that?
Kevin McCarthy is hugely talented. He is someone who works very well with the president. He is someone who has a broad coalition of support in Congress. He's well respected outside of Congress. He would be an exceptional speaker if given the opportunity to serve. I believe that there should be as smooth of a transition as possible, one that listens to all of the feedback from the many different dynamics and factions within the Republican Party. We have conservatives and moderates. We have people who belong to the Freedom Caucus.
If you had a choice between Steve Scalise and Kevin McCarthy, who would you vote for? And there might be others.
Well, Steve Scalise said yesterday that he'd be voting for Kevin McCarthy. So yeah, I don't know if it would come down to that. I would support,
you would support
Kevin,
McCarthy, okay.
And I believe that he would be an exceptional speaker. I do believe that the process right now should be one that improves the amount of regular order that gets used, that learns from what's happened over the course of of months and years, so that we can be more effective. That we can have more of a governing majority in the House. So, we should use it as an opportunity to get better. But we're in a pretty good place right now.
Thank you very, very much, Congressman. Always good seeing you. And by the way, Steve Scalise, he did echo that comment concerning his counterpart, Kevin McCarthy, but he didn't rule out those who wanted to vote for him to vote for him. I don't believe he has. Anyway, we're awaiting a briefing at the United Nations, also NATO. A lot going on today. All right, we're getting some more details on how annoyed the Russians are about this attack launched by the United States, France, and Britain against Syria overnight. They're expected to introduce a new draft resolution on those attacks. Russia, we're told, will be the second speaker at this council. Remember, any Security Council member demanding a meeting will get a meeting. The first speaker will be the Secretary General, or at least one of his cabinet members. But again, the Russian speaker will come after that, I assume, their ambassador to the United Nations. Anyway, all this will be live in about 25 minutes. So when that happens, we'll go there. In the meantime, NATO is in its own closed-door meeting right now. They'll be speaking later this morning. Jillian Turner has the latest. Jillian.
Neil, the U.S., France, and Britain are gearing up to brief their NATO partners momentarily on the overnight strikes. It's expected that most, if not all, of the 29 member countries are going to participate in this briefing. While NATO wasn't directly involved in this latest military move in Syria, Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg released a statement overnight. It reads in part, quote, I support the actions taken by the United States, the UK, and France against the Syrian regime's chemical weapons facilities and capabilities. This will reduce the regime's ability to further attack the people of Syria with chemical weapons. NATO has consistently condemned Syria's continued use of chemical weapons as a clear breach of international norms and agreements. The use of chemical weapons is unacceptable, and those responsible must be held accountable. U.S. and European leadership have made it clear they agreed to these strikes very quickly for their own individual reasons as well as for the good of the alliance.
I have taken this decision because I believe it is the right thing to do. I believe it is in our national interest, but I believe it is also important for the international community to be very clear about this issue, that we have seen people appearing to think that they can use chemical weapons with impunity.
NATO's leaders are also making it clear they've grown impatient, waiting around for the UN to take action against the Assad regime. The German defense minister going on the record today with the accusation that the UN Security Council had been, quote, blocked on this issue for days. Neil, will hear about this and much more from our NATO allies in just a little while, coming up at 11 a.m. Neil?
Jillian, great reporting as always. I appreciate it. Now, to someone who knows firsthand the impact of these strikes and can maybe sort out a lot of this drama back and forth post the strikes, Lieutenant General David, Deputy retired U.S. Air Force. General, thank you very much for taking the time. We're learning, sir, a little bit more about what the Russians plan to outline in this resolution, that they're very concerned that countries can freely violate the sovereign territory, in this case of the Syrian Arab Republic, at a moment the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons fact-finding mission team, these so-called inspectors, are on the ground looking for proof the chemical weapons were used. Now, we, of course, went on the notion that confirmed by the French that they were used, and they were used by the Syrian government, and that we responded in kind. But that is where they're going to draw the line, saying that we left before we had all information in place. What do you think of that?
I think it's nonsense, Neil. At some point, the coalition of civilized nations have to take action in the face of the paralysis of the United Nations. And 3 investigative teams on behalf of the United States, the French, and the British confirmed and verified that chemical weapons were used. They were used by the Syrian regime. End of story. Time to take action. And that's what was accomplished last night.
You know, General, I just wonder with that, and maybe it's just me just thinking it odd. Why would Assad do that? I mean, knowing full well that he'd be facing this kind of response. I know it feeds sort of this black helicopter crowd, you know, suspicion that this was all a setup. What do you make of that?
Well, Neil, what I would suggest is Assad, Kim Jong-un, the Russians to a degree, don't, avoid the temptation of mirror image. These people and these regimes are not like the American people, the British, the French. They are evil actors and megalomaniacs to a degree. So, there's no questioning the rationale along the lines of how civilized nations would behave, because they're evil actors. And so you're right, from a U.S. perspective, it makes no sense for Assad to do this, because, he is, in fact, complicating his situation because of the reactions that we saw happen last night. That's going to reduce his ability to accomplish his objectives and puts him in a bad light in the community of international nations. But it is what it is. These are not rational actors. Well, they may be rational actors, but they do not hold to the same norms of international behavior that the United States, French, and Britain and other civilized nations do.
I think that's a very nice way of saying they're nuts. But let me step back. I know you were the principal attack planner for Desert Storm, and that was back in 1991. Right. Incredible service back then, General, for which you have obviously a nation's thanks. But I'm wondering, and I'd like your take on the president in a tweet today saying mission accomplished. I know certainly what he meant, that much of the Syria's chemical weapons capability was badly degraded, not annihilated, but certainly significantly degraded. But people think mission accomplished and think George Bush back in 2003 and thinking that war was wrapped up, when in fact we learned later that it really wasn't. Dangerous, risky, what do you think? Well,
I think it's as simple as what you just laid out, Neil. Look, there's a difference between, a mission in military parlance is a limited activity like you saw last night. It is a specific mission with the intent to go in and neutralize, degrade, attempt to influence, deter Assad's use of chemical weapons by attacking these three particular targets. And that mission was accomplished. It was extraordinarily effective and very, very precise. But you're right. The implication is, if because of history we go back in the use of the term mission and the terminology mission accomplished as used by President Bush, talking about the larger strategic endeavor, there's a possibility for confusion, but it is simple as that. The mission replied to the activity of yesterday in attacking the air attacks on these three targets, not the overall strategic objective of deterring the Assad regime.
So by that, I take it, we're not done here. Is it your sense that we, beyond just keeping an eye on Assad and all, he's not done with this sort of stuff?
No, I think that's accurate. This attack was a gradual, but a more serious step to get Assad's attention than the 2017 attack on a single airfield. And while wiping out some of his chemical capability may not be sufficient to deter him, it's a prudent first step. And so we have to see how Assad and his co-conspirators in crime, the Russians and the Iranians, react. But the coalition needs to be prepared to sustain and increase pressure if that's necessary.
General, thank you very much for taking the time. I very much appreciate it. All right. In the meantime here, I want to switch you to the United Nations, looking live right there where they're awaiting an emergency Security Council meeting. I'm told when any Security Council member wants an emergency meeting, they'll get one, and usually within 2 hours, and that is indeed the case. That is supposed to commence in about 17 minutes or so. What's very clear right now is the Russians are furious at this, saying this was an unjustified attack. But what's kind of curious from the Russian ambassador is the fact that this insults the president of Russia, and that is unacceptable and inadmissible. In other words, we offended Vlad. All right, looking live outside the United Nations and inside where the British ambassador to the UN is taking questions from reporters on the justification for the action overnight against Syria. Britain was part of that, so was France, so was the United States. So 3 of the Security Council members were quite pleased and quite feeling justified in doing what they did and honoring what they did. Another member of that committee is Russia, and this might come as a Fox News alert to you, but they were not pleased. In fact, Vladimir Putin demanding an emergency meeting of the United Nations as a result, and they're going to have one. And it's going to kick off in about 13 minutes. We'll keep an eye on that. Meanwhile, political analyst Daniel McLaughlin, we've also got the host of Making Money, Charles Payne, and Gary Kalpam, all reading in on how this could maybe affect, rattle, calm markets next week. Charles Payne, what do you think?
You know, I think it's one of the things that there was some anxiety about this week. So it was a small, precise strike. There's been a commitment that nothing else would happen. The ball's back in Assad's court. So I think really it shouldn't hurt the markets. It could be one thing that the market's sort of relieved about, because we didn't know how big or large this could be. And
how many would help. I mean,
yeah,
the market's a bore, anything that's not quite nailed down.
The unknown is really scares the market more than anything else. They can handle the known almost no matter how bad it is, but it's the anxiety going into these things that really had the most impact.
Well, Daniel, now we know why the president took a little longer responding this go around than a year ago. He wanted to get a little bit more support. He seemed to get it. But what do you think? Where is all this going here? Because the fear is that a lot of people get integrate all their chemical weapons capability. Right. So it begs the question, do we go back in?
I think for now we're one and done, and I agree with Charles. I look back at what happened in 2017 after we had a similar but smaller strike almost a year ago to the day. Oil rose a little bit, prices rose a little bit on concern more about Russia and Iran. Right. And we saw gold rise a little bit too, just a 5-month high, because I think investors were looking for a haven. But I do think if this truly is one and done, we're not going to see too much sort of panic in the markets, because again, it's they abhor instability, but this is a relatively small and narrow strike.
Yeah, it's one thing that's taken off the hill for the time being, right? But there's plenty of other worries out there, right?
Oh, my goodness gracious. Whoa. Look, if nothing changes, if Russia doesn't do anything, I think oil prices, which have spiked up recently, probably come down, helps the market a little bit. But this is an event at that point in time. You're 3 days later next week when the market opens, and you have thousands of companies reporting earnings in the next couple of weeks.
And that's looking pretty good. That part is the fundamentals would keep markets going. That's looking pretty good.
Earnings are going to be fine. The question is, does the market already know it? We saw the financials on Friday come out with very good earnings and sold off markedly.
Why was that, by the way?
I just think the market's in the soup right now. The highs are the highs for now. The lows are the lows, and we're back and forth. And anything good is going to be sold down a little bit. Anything bad won't go down that much. The big question is, I've been talking to you about this for a few weeks. These big lows are big lows. If they get taken out, we're going to go into a real bearish market, but so far so good. But for me, it's not the news, it's how things react to the news. And when I see JP Morgan open up $2 and finish down $3 on monstrous volume, that's not Aunt Mary and Uncle Bob selling. That's your big institutional crowd. And that's something that has to be watched as we move into the next 2-3 weeks.
You know, Daniela touched on this, Charles, this notion that, and we're on the other side of your screen, the United Nations, with this emergency Security Council meeting will ensue in the next 10 minutes. And usually international developments, whether they're deemed crises or not, you know, whipsaw oil, to Danielle's point, and gold, again, to Danielle's point. But unless it drags whipsaw oil, to Danielle's point, and gold, again, to Danielle's point. But unless it drags on, it's a short-lived event. What do you see happening?
Yeah, I agree. And I think there might be some other forces here at work with respect to crude. And, you know, obviously there's a lot of functions for it. Also, as a proxy for the global economy, questions this big boom around the world, economic boom, is it phasing out? It might not be. You know, the market has this anxiety, but it's after the magnificent and amazing run-up that we've had. And I think Gary's right. Feels like we're just putting in some sort of a bottom, but the market's got to be tested. The rally's got to be tested. And I think that's exactly what we're doing right now. You know, if we start to cap these rigs, and I think they're coming on a little bit fast, but if they start to cap them, you might see oil go even higher over the next few months.
You know, Daniel, when you look at the overall global environment, I mean, we talk about earnings, we talk about underlying fundamentals, the economy, you know, picking up steam here, or at least looking pretty respectable, that there's very little that looks to disrupt this, say the trade war. The president hopes to avoid that. by rethinking the Trans-Pacific Partnership, by avoiding an outright, crisis with the Chinese, that they might give in on something. What's your sense?
Way
to counter the weight of China.
Exactly
and
right.
He got out of that.
He got out of that. He did, and I'll be honest. Hillary Clinton wanted to get out of it. I didn't think that was a good idea. I'm a free trader, if you can believe that, as a liberal. Our farmers like trade agreements as well.
That's not so crazy for a liberal, because you give it away for free.
You,
that's what that meant. No, I'm kidding. Go ahead.
No, and I think the other thing I'll say just about the markets is, if you think back, this is not that. We are resilient. The markets are resilient to this kind of a thing.
It is interesting when you look at all these cross currents.
This is not that.
If they needed them, how much outside events can, even in a short term, weigh on them, whether it's an event like this, whether it's fear of a expanding trade war with China, or who knows who else. What do you think?
I don't think I've ever seen a time in the markets where today's events affect the markets. Markets have always been...
Look at all these cross currents.
This is not that.
If they needed them, how much outside events can, even in a short term, weigh on them, whether it's an event like this, whether it's fear of a expanding trade war with China, or who knows who else. What do you think?
I don't think I've ever seen a time in the markets where today's events affect the markets. Markets have always been great at forecasting to the future. The markets top out 3 to 6 months before earnings died. Markets bottom before the economy picks up. Now it seems like every day we wake up to something else that markets have to deal with, and not small things, but big things. Trade wars. If a trade war does happen, if these tariffs get into place, 100 billion here, 50 billion there, China come back, that is going to hit markets. I'm telling you, 2,000-3,000 points.
I don't think we're going to see that.
I don't think so either. But the fact that markets have to wake up to it, the fact that business owners have to get away from it. I keep saying on TV, hopefully Trump's watching. Stop. Slow down.
But maybe it's
less.
having the desired effect. And Charles, hats off to you. You were the first to say, if everyone is talking against what he's doing, you were going to go pursue the logic of it. And the logic seems to be, if you get China to come to the table, make concessions without any of those tariffs taking effect, it could work.
I'm very confused on how, we think this is a hunky-dory situation. China's economy has become a juggernaut. Their average tariff is 10%. It used to be 15%.
All right.
It's worked for them. Something is wrong. If we don't try to stop it now, we'll never be able to stop it. Worked for them. Something is wrong. If we don't try to stop it now, we'll never be able to stop it. Yeah, there's always pain in these sort of situations. But there was a time when Americans were up for pain if it meant doing the right thing. But now we can't. That's why our debt will never go down. That's why we'll never do the right thing, because even an ounce of pain seems to be the worst thing that can happen to us.
All right, guys, thank you very much. I'm not actually thanking you for that. On me out, actually. But guys, thank you very much. We are waiting developments at the United Nations here. That's where you'll find our Laura Engel with the latest on what we could hear. The Russians clearly angry. They've demanded this meeting. They think that the United States, Britain, and France have overdone it, right? That's pretty much where they're coming from.
That's right, Neil, and this is certainly a very quick-moving morning. In fact, just about 20 minutes ago, we saw U.S. Ambassador Nikki Haley walking into one of the entrances here. This meeting is about to get underway any moment. Russia called the emergency meeting, as we've been reporting here on Fox, of the Security Council about 3 hours ago, 8:30 local time, following a joint U.S., UK, and French attack on Syria's chemical weapons infrastructure in Syria overnight. Now, Fox News is learning this morning that the Russians have introduced a draft resolution that condemns what it says is the, quote, aggression against the Syrian Arab Republic by the U.S. and its allies in violation of international law. Now, the resolution also demands that the U.S. and its allies immediately withdraw without delay and cease the aggression against Syria. This is the fifth meeting on Syria's chemical weapons here this week. On Tuesday, Russia used its sixth veto to halt a U.S. resolution that attempted to get the council to approve a new investigative measure to find out who exactly was behind the chemical attacks. Now, United States UN Ambassador Nikki Haley has said earlier in the week that Russia's attempt to protect Syria, saying its hands were covered in the blood of Syrian children. More to come from the UN here today, Neil.
All right, thank you very, very much. Again, we are not only waiting here that, of course, this will kick off with the Secretary General or one of his surrogates speaking first. That's the former policy on this, and then presumably the Russian ambassador following up. And we'll be getting the English translations. And I don't know if some of these can be translated, because apparently some people are furious and they might curse. So we might have to put this on a delay. But that's just what we do for you, America. More after this.